Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're really excited to have this conversation. My name is Deanna, and I am from Early Learning Nation, which is a free and independent magazine covering early learning, everything from groundbreaking research to early learning policy and best practices in the field. If you're not familiar with us, you can find our work at earlylearningnation.com. And if you're on Substack, we are also there at earlylearningnation.substack.com. For your binge watching pleasure, we've also got a YouTube channel. You can find Early Learning Nation on YouTube, where you can watch videos from our pop-up studios from around the country, where we speak with brilliant experts and advocates leading the way in the early learning field. So some housekeeping for this session. We do have the chat enabled so that you can both speak with each other and our illustrious panelists here joining me. But we do ask that if you want to ask a question, that you'll use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button called Q&A where you should be able to ask questions there. That'll help us keep track of questions and make sure that they don't get lost in the hopefully very chatty chat that we have. So please take a second to familiarize yourself with those features. And now on to the show. We're all gathered here to discuss Elliot Haspel's revealing new investigation. The end user is a dollar sign, not a child. How private equity and shareholders are reshaping American childcare. So first, let me introduce Elliot. Hi, Elliot. He's a nationally recognized childcare policy expert and writer. He is the author of Crawling Behind America's Childcare Crisis and How to Fix It, and a second forthcoming book. Ooh. His articles regularly appear in top publications such as The Atlantic and The Washington Post, and shockingly, you can read him on earlylearningnation.com with his monthly column, Elliot's Provocations. Elliot is joined by journalist Rebecca Gale. Hi, Rebecca. Great. Rebecca is a writer at the Better Life Lab at New America, which provided support for this investigative piece. Thank you very much. And where Rebecca covers childcare over at Better Life Lab. You can follow her on Instagram at Rebecca Gale Writing and subscribe to her indispensable new Substack newsletter. It doesn't have to be this hard. I love it. Also, if you want to follow Better Life Lab, you can follow them on Twitter at Better Life Lab, or you can follow them on Instagram at Better Life Lab _ New America. All right, I'm going to drop out and let you all take it away. Have a great conversation. Looking forward to it.
Deanna, thank you so much. And thank you to Linda and the Early Learning Nation team for really making this happen. It does take publications like yours to elevate the work that journalists like us do. And I'm really excited for this conversation, and I'm really pleased to be here to do this fireside chat Q&A with Elliot. And I've known Elliot since I started reporting on childcare. He was one of the first in-depth phone calls I made to be like, explain the landscape to me. And since then, he's become both a colleague and a source and a partner in many ways. So really excited on behalf of the Better Life Lab and myself to uplift his work here. So I have a handful of questions that I'm going to go through with Elliot, and I really encourage anybody listening along to put additional questions you have in the chat, because we really want to get into as many things as we can with this piece. So first, Elliot, my question for you is that many of us know that you are a very prolific writer, but a piece of investigative journalism like this is different from your normal byline article. So I'd love if you could tell us a bit about how and why you decided to pursue this topic on childcare and private equity, and what your process has been to do such research and digging and the extensive fact-checking for such a piece.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you, Rebecca, for your support. And again, to the whole Early Learning Nation team, Linda, it really was a bit of a leap of faith to take on a piece this extensive and potentially spicy. And I appreciate everyone for being here to talk about it. So Back in 2022, when many of the pandemic effects on the childcare system were still raging acutely, I started to see a couple of headlines pop up about some of the large corporate chains acquiring sites, continuing to grow, and it sort of triggered in my mind this question of, well, are we seeing a sort of two-tier system where the chains are having a different experience than everyone else? And I started looking into it. And when you start looking into it, you start to realize some interesting things. So it's like, okay, here's KinderCare, the largest one, and they're owned by a private equity firm, and Learning Care Group is the second largest, and they're owned by a private equity firm. And you go down the line, and I quickly realized this is interesting that 8 of the 11 largest chains by capacity are owned by private equity firms. And a ninth used to be owned by a private equity firm and is now publicly traded on the stock market. And that's a fascinating feature of our childcare system that I felt like almost no one was really talking about. So I did publish a sort of just a basic policy brief with some information about that. And then the next month in December 2022, the New York Times came out with a pretty big article looking at private equity and childcare, and also revealing for the first time some information about the political activity of those chains when it came to the efforts to improve the childcare system. And so this has been swirling in my mind for a while. And there was a piece here and a piece there over the past couple of years, but it occurred to me no one had ever really done a deep dive. How are these chains making money? What's the international experience been? What's this mean for parents, for educators, for kids on the ground in a very real way? And so I went to Linda, the editor of Illuminate Nation. I said, "Hey, I have this idea. I'd love to do a long form investigative piece," and thankfully she was into it. So it took me about 6 months to research and write. It was a combination of using all of my networks to try to identify folks who were current or former employees who are willing to speak, looking at the existing research base, both here in the US and internationally, looking at financial records, looking at legal filings, and just compiling all of that. And then, as you well know, Rebecca, a whole lot of editing, right? Like this piece went through many, many iterations. And because even though it is, we call this reported opinion, because I do have an opinion on this, and then we should be upfront about that. We wanted to make sure that this was a really solid, just airtight case that I was trying to advance. And so we engaged an independent, experienced fact checker to vet it. We engaged an editor who had experience doing investigative pieces like this. So we really took this through a lot of different iterations to make sure that what we finally published was something that we feel really proud of and are able to stand behind. And I hope really advances the conversation about the role of these private equity firms and shareholders and investors in the childcare sector.
Agree, I think it does. And 6 months is indeed a long time. So I can tell the extra work that went into this piece, both in terms of making sure everything is fact-checked and smooth, and that such a deep dive piece like this really requires that sort of due diligence. One thing I did like about your piece a lot is it included a bit of something I call private equity 101, explaining how these firms work and how they can make a lot of profit in the short term in industries that are not usually considered very profitable, like childcare specifically. And yet they do make money. And one of the lines in your piece that stuck out to me is that private equity firms, and I'm quoting this, don't need to serve the whole market. They only need to serve the profitable parts of the market. So can you walk us through what those profitable and unprofitable parts of the childcare industry look like, and who wins and loses under these types of models?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that's the number one question I get when I talk about this is, why is private equity even interested in childcare? All we hear about is how financially difficult childcare is as a sector, right? Programs can barely keep the lights on. Educators are getting paid next to nothing. It's incredibly expensive for parents. Like, who is possibly making money off of this? And what I found is there's a playbook. And you're right, private equity's honed this, and it's through its work in many other sectors. And I think we all probably know about their role in nursing homes, and they've also been involved in autism services and medical clinics and prison services. You can kind of go down the line. And so in childcare, what I found is that there are sort of 5 main ways that these companies are making enough money to return the profit that private equity firms are looking for, which according to the New York Times, can be up to 15 to 20% profit margins. And so the first one, as you're saying, is really targeting an affluent clientele. This is painting with a broad brush, and it's not every single chain in every single situation, but broadly speaking, these chains tend to want to serve middle, upper middle, and truly affluent families, and then they charge them a lot. So that's one place you can get money from. There's a real push to maximize enrollment, because in this country we treat childcare much more like a private market good, right? It's like a gym or a restaurant more than a public good, like a public school or a library. It's pay to play. So the number of enrolled families you have is the amount of revenue. That's the multiplier to the amount of revenue that you're getting. So lots of pressure to keep enrollment always as high as possible. You can lower your operational costs as much as possible. And so that includes, these chains don't tend to pay their employees considerably better than the ones that aren't making this kind of a profit. I cited some folks I talked to who were saying they were asked to basically reduce the number of sheets of paper per day they were giving kids. They were shifting cleaning, so daily cleaning responsibilities were going to the teachers instead of hiring an outside cleaning service, things like that. So you can reduce your costs. A third way is you can engage with institutions. And I mean by that is corporations, public, sort of local and state governments, and even universities and colleges are all clients that tend to work with these large chains when they're providing on-site childcare for their employees. There's one example I mentioned in the piece. Maricopa County in Arizona, that's Phoenix, recently entered into a $13 million contract with KinderCare to run a center for their employees. And that's obviously incredibly lucrative, potentially. A fourth way you can make money is through real estate, of all things. So many childcare programs, one of the best financial assets they have is that they own their building. And a common private equity tactic, which appears to be common in childcare as well, is you, as a private equity firm, come in and basically require that the site that you acquired sell off their property to a real estate investor, someone else. But the proceeds of that sale do not generally go back to the site. They generally go up to the private equity firm. But now the site has to lease back the property previously owned. So it now has a line of debt, right, that it has to pay that didn't previously have to pay, or that can be more than a mortgage if it was paying a mortgage. But the sales, the proceeds from those real estate sales, again, can be incredibly lucrative for private equity firms. And the fifth way, which is really constrained just to the franchised chains, and so that's your Primrose, Goddard, chains like that, is to require franchise fees and royalties. And those are everything from your kind of standard royalty payments up to requiring that sites use proprietary curricula, proprietary technology, and they have to pay, again, the company for that. So when you combine kind of these basket of different profit-making strategies, you can start to see, okay, like there actually is a path to making profit in childcare. That's not one that tends to be pursued by independent or community-based programs, right? They're not engaging in sale leaseback. They're not generally working with large corporations or large governments. They're not generally reducing operational costs to that degree. You can start to see the profit maximization sort of play out when you understand here's how they're basically squeezing blood from a stone in a sense.
Wow. We're going to get to some of those points you made also in the conversation, especially the one about businesses and about catering to the affluent. But I wanted to actually take one more step back on this about why private equity is in the childcare space to begin with from a more macroeconomics perspective, and pull another quote from your piece. This one's from Elizabeth Lewant from Neighborhood Villages, which is a really integrated, innovative group in the childcare space, by the way. I hope someone from their group might be here today, so I wanted to say that. So one of her line was, quote, "How would you feel if I told you that, say, Morgan Stanley owned your child's elementary school?" And when I read this, I actually laughed out loud, because we have this expectation in our country that elementary school is not up for profit sharing. But yet we don't extend that same interest, same mentality to childcare, and which is why companies are coming in and finding ways to make it more profitable for their shareholders. So why do you think elementary and secondary education is treated very differently than early education?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think in a lot of ways, this entire article is sort of circling these core questions of what and who is childcare for. So again, we have a history in this country of treating childcare, especially since the 1970s, as a market good. So the brief history, right, of for-profit childcare starts to kick up in the late 1960s when we're starting to see an increasing number of middle-class mothers, and we should frankly say white mothers, entering the workforce. Previously, there had always been some mothers who had worked, but predominantly those had been mothers of color or poor mothers. And so, there's an opportunity, right? And in 1971, Richard Nixon vetoes the Comprehensive Child Development Act, which was started to create a nationally funded, locally run system of childcare programs. There is massive need for childcare. If you look at the graph of women's labor force participation starting in the late 60s and going through the 1970s and 1980s, it's almost a straight line up. And so you can understand how, an entrepreneur, someone looking to make money, would be like, sure, like I'm going to start offering like some sort of for-profit childcare system, because in that moment, we, unlike many other countries, the United States decided to say, we're going to push this into the market. We're not going to invest enough public money to create a functional, publicly funded system. And we're still playing with that legacy today. So it is a real discontinuity when you think about all of the reasons we have public schools, right? Public schools inarguably serve a childcare function. And I like to say, if anyone didn't believe that, then I hope you didn't have to suffer through Zoom kindergarten like I did in 2020. They serve a childcare function, right? They serve a function of helping children develop healthily and develop the skills and knowledges they need. They're community assets that help entire neighborhoods. Like you can go down the line, all the reasons that we spend so much money on public schools and make them free for everyone. And then you look at almost all that logic applies to childcare, but we treat it as if it is this radically different thing that belongs in the free market instead.
Yes. I think you're absolutely hitting on to the big points, whether it's the public good or the individual. And a lot of that does come from the way we were raised and changing some of those mindsets, which is something that we work on a lot at Better Life Lab as part of that larger narrative change so that people can understand that childcare really has this larger purpose to serve. Another takeaway from your piece that I wanted to talk about is that you mentioned as private equity gains a larger share of the childcare industry, their political influence will grow. And the example you gave is one that many of us who've worked in the field know, was Build Back Better, the bill that would have put billions of dollars into our childcare system. And one of the many groups that opposed it was the Early Care and Education Consortium. And how do you see the role of such political interests evolving as private equity gains a stronger foothold in the childcare industry? And do you think they might be more incentivized to be part of a larger public system? And I realize I didn't explain what the ECEC is in my question, so maybe you can explain that as well to our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the broader point you're getting at is, are the interests in the end, and Melissa Botich from the National Women's Law Center quoted this. I quoted her in my piece. Is there an inherent conflict of interest, right? If essentially the deal on the table at some point is, look, we will put in hundreds of billions of dollars to create a publicly funded childcare system where parent fees are significantly reduced, if not making entirely free for everyone like our schools, and in which early childhood educators are paid not just like a living wage, but like a family sustaining professional wage that respects the work that they do, and where it's enough money so that our facilities are high quality, we're providing children with the type of experiences that they all deserve. And the string attached to that is we are going to limit the amount of profit that any given company or any given childcare owner can make, right? We're going to limit the amount of equity compensation. We're going to limit the amount of dividends you can pay back to your investors. Like, we're going to put these caps on. That's the deal. You get all of this, but the trade-off is you're not going to be able to make very much profit on this system. I think the question is, what will the chains do in that situation, right? What at that point when you have, and we've seen limited versions of this. So as you mentioned during Build Back Better, which did have mandatory caps on parent fees and did have mandatory living wage minimums, we saw Early Care and Education Consortium, which is essentially an advocacy and lobbying group that represents many of the large chains, according to the New York Times, working behind the scenes with Senator Manchin in particular against the bill. And then the month after Senator Manchin kills Build Back Better, many executives from many of these chains provide donations to his campaign PACs and to his campaign coffers. Right, so we've seen that. We saw even more recently in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Senate passes a bill which involves quite a lot of public money, $475 million a year in grants that are going to help childcare programs keep up their operations going, again, pay their staffs better and keep costs down. But the Massachusetts Senate put some guardrails in place. They say if you have more than 10 sites in Massachusetts, you have to agree to certain conditions. Those conditions include things like accepting a reasonable number of children who are on subsidy, which is a proxy for lower income children. You have to agree to use a certain percentage of the grant to pay your educators better and to follow a wage ladder that's going to be put into place. You have to agree to certain number of sort of financial disclosure agreements, all strings attached, right? And what I found is that, ECEC quietly tried to get those particular provisions stripped out. They sent a letter to the chair and vice chair of the committee asking them to amend out the provisions that would have targeted the larger chains. And so again, and we've seen this internationally as well, I'll note. So the concern here is economic power often equal political power, and private equity in particular is enormously powerful politically. I have a quote in there from Brendan Ballou, who I could say if everyone wants to do one thing at the end of this, go to your local library or go to your whatever you get books and get the book Plunder, How Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. It's by Brendan Ballou, who's the former U.S. Special Counsel for Private Equity at the Department of Justice. It will make you, it will open your eyes and it will probably make you pretty angry. But, Brendan Ballou talks about how the Congress works for few constituencies harder than they work for private equity. Private equity is an enormous contributor to many politicians' campaigns. They're also often personal friends with many of these politicians, right? Like the owner of one of the largest private equity firms in the country just bought the Baltimore Orioles. Like this is a very wealthy, very well-connected set of people who have shown themselves time and again willing to get involved in politics if there's something that threatens their business model. And universal childcare, it does threaten the business model. And the last thing I'll say on this is, this isn't a secret. So Bright Horizons, which is the one chain that's publicly traded, has to submit SEC documents, right? Documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And they have to be honest on those because it's a legal document. And they're very transparent that if there is increased government investment that just puts more money in the pockets of families and has no other strings attached to it, that's good for them because it means they could potentially start serving like more market, right? More market share. They say if there's government funded or government mandated childcare funding, though, that could actually be a major threat, I'm paraphrasing, to their profit because there could be lower cost options because their labor costs could increase, right? All of these things. So there's no subterfuge here. If you have a profit motive, anytime that your costs are going up or your potential to draw out revenue is going down, it's a threat to your business model. So you're likely going to do something about that.
Elliot, I just want to say that the chat is like blowing up when you talk about the guardrails, and I think a lot of people feel really strongly that what you're talking about makes a lot of sense. And I'd be interested if you wind up doing even more on what those guardrails look like in the Massachusetts process. I did read that in the piece, but I think there's potentially some more things we're uncovering there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did want to you sort of touched on a point about the middle and upper class, and I wanted to go to that question. That you'd mentioned that private equity groups are focused on expanding childcare options for middle and upper class families because these families can theoretically pay more for childcare. And also in doing so, they would not be beholden to families who receive childcare subsidies. And one of the solutions that you've discussed and we've written about as well at Better Life Lab is increasing the subsidy rates. And some states are doing this through the pandemic era funding they received for childcare. So it's a bit in the weeds here, but I think it's worth having the conversation. Can you walk us through how increasing the subsidy rates for childcare providers changes the calculus on who childcare providers decide to serve?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that is clear from private equity's work in other sectors is these firms tend to really love a steady source of government money. There is a reason why they are so engaged in, for example, prison services. Like private equity firms own most of the companies that deal with prison food and prison phone calls, like those sorts of things, because they get money for it. The reason they want to be in healthcare is because there's Medicare and Medicaid dollars available, right? Public money, great. It's a reliable, predictable source of money. In childcare, generally speaking, the reimbursement rate, sort of the per child amount of money that if a child receiving aid goes to a program, right, the government will pay that program X dollars. In most states and for most of the past several decades has been pretty low. So the target that the federal government sets for states until recently was 75% of market rate. Market rate is based off of the survey of what people are currently paying, which, as we know, is actually less than the true cost of care. It's less than what most childcare programs need to be charging if they want to bring in enough revenue to pay their staff well, again, maintain their facility, all of those things. So an already artificially depressed market rate takes 75% of that, and many states aren't even at 75%. And it's not that much money per child. So compare that to a full pay parent, right? A parent who you're charging $15,000, $20,000 a year for, and the gap was so large that it hasn't been particularly attractive, with the one exception of kinder care. And that is partially to do, I think, with their sheer size, but, and credit where credit's due, kinder care has subsidy coordinators on staff that do help families access that. They do work with a fairly reasonable percentage of children who receive subsidy. As the subsidy rates start going up, and as more states start to adopt this cost of quality, this cost of care, the true cost model, it possibly could, and I would argue likely would, incentivize some of these chains that are only serving upper, middle class and upper class families to come down into the subsidy market and start to try to capture those dollars, which, given some of the behaviors that these chains show, I think raises some concerns, right? It raises some concerns around quality. It raises concerns again, motivation. It raises concerns around profit motive and conflicts of interest. But that's what I imagine we could see pretty predictably, is as more public money starts becoming available. There's a quote I have from a UK advisor, because the UK has been doing a lot of putting more money in. There's like, if we put more public money in, they're going to come and try to take more public money out. And that's we have to put guardrails up against, in my view.
That is really interesting. I want to also include a conversation about staff compensation, which I think in a lot of our childcare conversations doesn't always get enough attention. So I really appreciate your willingness to include staff compensation in your piece. And one way that the large chains could help with staff compensation is their ability to provide health insurance and other fringe benefits that many independent and nonprofit programs are unable to offer, and especially in places where they don't have programs like paid family leave at the state level, these childcare providers cannot afford to do that. In your research, has the involvement of larger childcare chains meant higher or more stable wages for staff?
So it has not seen substantially higher wages. That looking from what analysis I can do, including looking at states where they have to publish salary ranges, they seem to be about on par with the sort of independent, nonprofit, community-based programs. Many of these chains will offer benefits, which, as you say, the others are not able to do. So that is an attractive part, I think, of them as an employer. The health insurance is offered by most of these large chains, things like that. So we do see that. I think what is interesting, and I want to pull back for a second, by the way, and put a fine point on something, because I think these conversations can get a little bit fraught. What I'm talking about in this article is a question about management and in corporate decision making. I am not talking about the frontline educators and directors at these sites. They are working just as hard under just as difficult circumstances as any other childcare educator. And then to this point, they're not actually getting paid significantly more. So, the compensation package overall might be slightly better in some of these change sites. But one thing we see, which is interesting, is actually the turnover is much, much higher. So I cite in the piece a Department of Health and Human Services study using 2019 data, so not too long ago, and they found that the rates of what they call high turnover, which means 20% or more of the child-facing staff in a program leaves over the course of a year, it was nearly 50% among their the large for-profit chains that they looked at, and even among for-profit independents, it was quite high as well, compared to about 30% for the nonprofit and government programs, so school-based pre-K, Head Start, things like that. That is an enormously high churn rate, which when you think about everything we know about also child development and the importance of the reliable, consistent, stable caregivers, it's not great for the children either. So what that tells me, at least, and this is just my analysis and speculation, is that a slightly better compensation package is not outweighing some issue going on with working conditions that is causing the educators at these chain sites to turn over at just a really alarmingly high rate.
Yes. You mentioned this earlier, so I'm jumping back a little bit. The comment from Melissa Botich at the National Women's Law Center, where she basically asked, and I have the quote here, if we want private equity, a heavily financialized model focused on short-term profit, to be the appropriate model for childcare. And we've talked in our conversation about whether childcare really is a public good or if it's up to the individuals. And I think where people stand on those two issues kind of maybe helps guide where their feelings are on funding it. But we also know that mentalities are shifting, and there is a generation of people coming up and coming of age and starting families with different expectations. So I'm curious to hear how you see the mentality shifting in the coming years as with more conversations surrounding care and the role private equity could play in this. Do you think if you and I were to revisit this conversation in a few years, there would be different expectations on how childcare should be treated and therefore what role public equity would play?
I think we're at a really interesting hinge point. It's hard for me to predict because there are multiple kind of paths we could go down, right? And I think some of this depends on what decisions policymakers make in the coming years. Partially, I think most parents, for example, don't know that a private equity firm owns their company. I would think that's pretty safe to say, right? Like if you're sending your kid to kindergarten, I doubt you know that Partners Group out in Switzerland is actually the ones that owns them, and and that is making some of these decisions. So that's part of it. I think that, and I think a lot of policymakers don't know that. I've talked to several who've been surprised, right? This is actually news to them because that's part of the playbook, right? Kind of these names are not names that you necessarily know. Partners Group and Apex Partners. These aren't KFC, right? Like it's not a company that you know the names of. So that's one step, I think, is a question of, is there an illumination of the fact that this is even happening? And then I do think there's a question about what decisions do policymakers make? Because ultimately, I think if there are no guardrails put up and there's more public money flowing, we are going to start to see increasing capture by private equity firms and by investors more broadly. The UK is a good example. The UK is heavily captured by private equity firms and investors more broadly in for-profit childcare. And so it's something they're having to wrestle with. We're at a point now where private equity and investors together, they have captured about 10 to 12% of the licensed childcare market. That's large, but not dominant yet. If that gets up over the next couple of years to 20, 30%, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do anything really to change that, because ultimately, and I was just talking with someone over in the UK the other day, it's not in this piece, there is an opportunity or maybe a danger that at some point, and this came out in Canada too, the chains threatened to say, okay, fine, if that's what you're going to do, if you're going to put these guardrails up, we're basically going to take our ball and go home, right? Like we're going to not serve this market, and you're already in a supply crunch. You're already unable to serve the number of parents who need care. So what are you going to do if we take our slots and leave? And, and so I think that's another kind of question here of, we're not at the point yet where that's happened in the US. I want to be clear about that. We're not at the point, but it is an interesting question when you think about, when you and I have this conversation in a few years, how do we now start to set guardrails in such a way that we don't see so much capture that it becomes incredibly difficult to do anything about it. And I would say in other sectors in the US, the nursing home industry most notably, it's really an issue where there's so much investor activity that it's really hard to come up with a policy and implement a policy and pass a policy that's going to change that.
That is good to hear. I was wondering you might be more optimistic or not, but I want to sort of go, I want to have one more question, and then I want to take some of the questions from the audience, and we've had a really active chat. So I really appreciate people spending some time coming here to learn about this issue. And I encourage you, if you have the time, to sit down and read Elliot's piece, cover to cover, and soak it in. And I think there's some really good points brought up here. But I want to turn it back to Elliot with the final question that I have, which is, so what now? What can policymakers, advocates, and people who care about the future of childcare industry do after reading your piece or hearing this conversation?
Yeah, so there's that old line that the best disinfectant is sunlight, and I think that's the first step here. There's a lot we don't know still. If you read my piece, you'll know that I'm very honest about that. In the US, we don't have very rigorous research studies, for example, as we have to rely a lot on what's happened internationally. So I think part of this is raising the awareness. So making sure that lawmakers and policymakers at the state and federal level know about this. I have called before for, I think Congress or state legislatures should really think about holding hearings on this issue. We've seen that be very effective in other similar areas. For example, like for-profit higher education had a series of very important congressional hearings around the turn of the 2010s that laid the groundwork for policy change to happen later on. So I think that's the first step, is we have to really illuminate what's going on. And then the second thing, I think, is to understand what guardrails do exist. We're not going from a blank slate. We have Massachusetts, which I think is maybe the strongest example right now. I mentioned in the piece that New Jersey's public pre-K system actually lets private providers into it, which I think is fine in a mixed delivery system, but it also has really rigorous guardrails, including an actual profit cap. You cannot make more than 2.5% more than the sort of allowable expenses that they'll pay for you. And no, none of the large chains work in New Jersey's pre-K system. So I think we can look at examples that already exist, precedents that already exist, and push this. I also say, I don't think this one, I know it's maybe naive of me to say in 2024 America, I don't think this one needs to be a partisan issue. I don't think anyone in red states, blue states, small towns, large cities are you necessarily going to be comfortable when they start getting really deeply into the implications of having private equity firms making decisions about what's going on in programs that serve infants and toddlers and and other young children and their families. So I do think the first step is, let's talk about this, talk about it with each other. Let's talk about it with our policymakers. Let's just make sure there's a baseline understanding of what's happening, and let's get some more information, and then let's figure out what's going to be effective policy. Again, I want to reiterate too what Melissa said, and what I want to say, they're not necessarily bad people. There's not anything wrong with wanting to make profit in general, but there's a real question about whether childcare is the place where we want to see profit maximizing behavior, right? It's very, very, very different to try to maximize profit on the backs of toddlers and their families than to try to make money running a restaurant or running, a department store.
Yes, and that is a great point to end on, making money off toddlers and infants as the main priority. So I believe Deanna from Early Learning Nation is going to moderate the questions, which have been coming in at a pretty good clip. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and some of these are follow-ups from what we already discussed, and some may be new conversations. So Deanna, I'll turn it back.
Yeah. There are so many great questions, and maybe there's a way that even if we can't get to all of them, maybe we can figure out something that we can address some of these in future work together. So I have been really enjoying the chat, everyone listening and watching. A lot of the questions, there were several that talked about the balancing a little bit these kind of mom and pop childcares that are for profit, because someone mentioned that doing a nonprofit childcare center has its own hurdles to overcome, and is challenging in a number of different ways. How do you balance kind of the entrepreneurial spirit? Someone mentioned that a lot of childcare businesses that are Black and Brown owned, we want to be able to support that investment in these communities, and by these folks. So, how do you balance the guardrails so that it doesn't also kind of kill, some of that that mixture? I'm wondering if you can start there.
Yeah, it's such an important question. I'm so glad that came up. So yeah, it's really important to distinguish between these independent for-profit programs, which in many, if not most cases, like the profit part is sort of in quotes, right? You're really trying to make a living. I think this is actually maybe the most, the way you can see this the most is by looking at family childcare programs. Almost all family childcare programs are not organized as nonprofits, right? But we also know that family childcare educators are barely scraping by, right? So we're talking about someone who's just trying to make a living versus talking about a large company backed by an investor who's only in there because they think they can make 15 to 20% profit margins. Again, if the profit wasn't there, private equity wouldn't be there. So those are and I think, so that's the general point. But to get more specific, this is why and I keep saying it, but I really think they did a bang up job. What Massachusetts did was, for the first time, they legislatively defined what it means to be a large for-profit chain as opposed to an independent. So by saying, if you are a for-profit and if you have more than 10 sites, is what the Massachusetts Senate said, in our state, then these conditions apply to you. If you don't, then they don't apply to you. So for that mom and pop entrepreneur, for the family childcare, they're not caught up in those conditions. And I think that idea of, we can say, and this has been done in other countries, Australia did it, a few other countries have done it as well, to say, we can say in statute, legislatively, or in regulation, like, here are large for-profit chains here, so we're defining you, and here's what applies to you, and it doesn't apply to the small mom and pops, it doesn't apply to the family childcare providers. I think that's what we have to do, because we can run into unintended consequences otherwise.
Absolutely. Following that, your mention of Massachusetts, someone was asking if anyone has started to do follow-up studies about what impact this has had on children specifically, and the children that are participating in these programs.
The Massachusetts law, well, specifically, so that's still in. So the Massachusetts Senate has passed it. The Massachusetts House is still working through their version of the budget. So
okay.
we don't know yet. Yeah, what the consequences. I will be watching it carefully though to see what the final product is. And then yes, I think this is the other point to Rebecca's question: what can we do if there are any philanthropists on? Right, like, we need research. We need research studies. We need people tracking this. We don't have very many of them right now. So I think that is an important place for investing in sort of R&D.
Absolutely. Yes, if there are any philanthropists on, please do get in touch. Just kidding. Anyway, that's actually a big question that has happened got asked in a couple of different ways. Is what should parents and providers be focused on as far as targeting their own efforts? You started to kind of speak to this. Like, is it policy? Is it legislators? Is it awareness raising? Like, where should people who want to do something, where should they go with it?
Yeah, absolutely, legislators. Like, this is gonna have to be a policy conversation. There is very little that an individual parent can do about private equity ownership of childcare, other than choose whether or not that isn't a concern of they're sending their child. But the other thing we should say is, a lot of parents don't have a choice, right? We have a supply constraint system because we don't treat it like a public good, because we don't fund it adequately enough. And so when you don't have very many options and the only option available to you is a chain site, like, yeah, you're going to take it. And I don't want to say that they're all bad. They're obviously not. There's I mentioned the piece several times. There's lots of variation in quality, but plenty of them are perfectly reasonable quality, or even good quality. But I think this idea of, like, going to ones state rep or state senator or congressional representative and saying, I just found out that like my kid's childcare is owned by a private equity firm that from Switzerland or from the UK or wherever. Like, did you know this? And like, are we okay with this? And maybe we are, but like, let's at least have that conversation. I think that's a real place that could be used, because as I said, we're early days on this. It is, I've been came out the number of publicly published things about private equity and childcare on basically one hand. So I think we do need to do awareness raising as the first step.
Yeah, and along those lines too, a number of people asked about unionizing childcare workers. What role does labor play, and is that helpful? Is that a stumbling block? How do you see the role of unionization?
Yeah, this gets much more into like Elliot's opinion versus like things that I necessarily reported in the piece. I will say, for context, the chains have largely tended to be wary of unionization efforts. Not shocking, most large companies are. There's one example I give of KinderCare. They allege this was unrelated, but after a site on the University of Southern California's campus votes to unionize, a month later they decide the KinderCare decides to shut down that site altogether. Right now, there's an issue going on in the Portland, Oregon area where two sites that are owned by a Guidepost Montessori. This is not private equity backed. Their parent company is backed by venture capitalists, which is a different model. It's more minority ownership, but still there's a profit motive, right? They immediately after two sites vote to unionize last month, decided to shut those sites down. So and KinderCare, Bright Horizons, they say in their SEC filings, unionization is a threat to our profit. So I think we have a fairly safe case to say that like the chains are not generally thrilled with the idea of unionization. So I'll say that there are very, very, very few childcare programs that are unionized. A few of them in I think New York, which are captured as part of some of the unions there. But it's a deeply fragmented system. I think that is an interesting question. I think that is one interesting way to potentially push back against sort of this profit maximizing behavior, but I wouldn't want to go further than that because it gets sort of outside the scope of my personal reporting here.
Gotcha. I'm scanning through. Rebecca, have you seen questions that I just want to give you a chance to jump back in?
Yeah, I did. I've seen a number of questions about the infants and toddlers as compared to the preschoolers, and why that makes a difference for where childcares would decide to target in terms of, and some people in the chat have mentioned that their programs have dropped infant care because it's less profitable. So can you talk a bit about that and how potentially private equity would navigate that with those high staff ratios? I don't know how they would make more money.
Yeah, I definitely will. Oh, I wanted to circle back one quick second on the unionization thing. The one group that's unionized in this country in a couple of states are the family childcare providers. So check out Childcare Providers United in California. They've done some really cool stuff if you want to see an example of a childcare union. So this question of infants and toddlers, this is true, I think, across private equity backed programs and non-private equity backed programs. They're more expensive, right? The child to adult ratio is much lower. In most states, it's 1 to 4. Whereas when you're getting up to preschoolers, you can be 1 to 10, 1 to 12 or higher. So the unit economics are pretty rough for infants and toddlers. I always like to say for the young infants in particular, like honestly, that's a paid family leave issue. Like that's really where the first part of kind of the childcare arc. But yeah, so there is, I think, a question, and I did not find enough evidence to say this conclusively when I was looking into it of if you're looking to maximize profit, does that mean you don't want to serve infants and toddlers? I think that is a plausible case. It calls for more research. We don't have an answer to that yet that I found.
Can you say the name of the union again? Someone asked.
Childcare Providers United. It looks like someone just dropped a link into the chat.
And there also was a question that I know has come up when I came in our conversations earlier about this focus on full-time enrollment.
Yeah.
It's considered best practices, but you also talked about it also can become a problem. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the ways you thought were either unique or different in the way private equity approached full-time enrollment.
Yeah, so obviously full-time enrollment is important for any program, again, for healthy finances. We know because we go back to this is the way we fund childcare in this country. And so this, again, we keep coming back to that. We wouldn't have these problems if we didn't treat it quite so much like a market base, which is something one of the folks in Canada who I interviewed said, which I agree with. However, that being said, there seems to be a difference between we need full enrollment and we're going to do all reasonable things to make sure we have full enrollment. And like full enrollment is basically a priority to be pursued at the cost of most other things. And so what I mean by that is, I found in KinderCare, a part of the director's bonuses are tied to whether their enrollment numbers. We have examples of directors basically being asked to stay after if they were not able to complete a certain number of kind of enrollment activities in a given day. So, and potentially, and this is where it gets, fraught, but there are allegations that programs kept teachers who they knew to either be not well enough trained or to have engaged in some pretty egregious behavior, because this seems to be the case, and I want to use the word allegedly because again, I'm working off of the sources. They didn't want to lose the enrollment numbers. If a teacher is not prepared to be in a classroom or a teacher is engaging in really egregious behavior and you remove that teacher from your program, you just reduce the total number of children you can serve. And the question of if you're willing to make that trade-off, I think looks different if you're a nonprofit community-based program versus a program that is reporting up a corporate chain and you having to have targets for enrollment that is tied to one's bonuses and that whose CEO's compensation is tied in some measure to how much money they're returning to their private equity owners. And so, I quoted one former Bright Horizons director in the piece who said safety versus the bottom line. Like I ran into that several times and I know peers who did. And so that's again where to me, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road of that conflict of interest. When it's those micro level decisions, can we close this classroom or not? Never an easy decision, but is the scale is going to tip one way or the other depending on what the corporate structure is? I think it's very likely the answer is yes.
I have one more question I want to pull from the Q&A that has to do with something you and I spoke about back in February. A report you had done with Better Life Lab was on questioning the promise of employer-sponsored childcare. And one of the questions we got is that if you see any connections between recent policies promoting employer-based childcare and private equity's increasing role in the sector. So can you talk a bit about that combination?
I think there's a good chance that if those employer incentives are not designed well, or again with guardrails, we are going to add fuel to private equity's capture of market share. And what I mean by that is it is the easy button. If you're being told as a company that your access to federal funding or potentially there are tax incentives available, if you offer childcare to your employees and you decide to go in an on-site childcare route, the single easiest thing to do is call up KinderCare or call up Bright Horizons. They have entire departments. I'm sure they're filled with good people and they will help you get that set up, right? And so, Julie Cashin and Leah Woods from the Century Foundation, they mentioned this in a recent report, which was largely laudatory about the CHIPS Act, but talking about how if all we do is see corporations going with these large investor-backed chains, we are just going to be shoveling money towards private equity firms. So I think, again, that has to be to think about how would we design that. If we're going to offer employer-sponsored benefits for employer-sponsored childcare, which I obviously have my reservations about overall, but if we're going to do it, there are better and worse ways to design it. And I think designing it in ways that more explicitly incentivize working with community-based providers, supporting, community-based independent providers, supporting family childcare providers, I think that is going to be better. And the last thing I'll say on that is, and I quote him in the piece, like, it is telling that the CEO of Bright Horizons, right, was on the record saying like the CHIPS Act is a basically like the gratifying conclusion of years of advocacy, right? If they're thrilled about it, like that tells you something about how they think they're going to benefit from it.
Absolutely. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
One thing I always like to ask people after interviewing them, is there anything that did not come up in this conversation that you personally wanted to add or say?
We haven't talked as much, I think, about the equity concerns in full. So that we talked about the serving the affluent versus the non-affluent. I did the section in there, which I found disturbing to research, where the Justice Department entered into settlements with both Learning Care Group and KinderCare around issues with around the American with Disabilities Act. Specifically, there was an allegation in that Learning Care Group had a company-wide policy that staff would not administer insulin to diabetic children. There's another chain where it was an issue with a child with Down syndrome who could not meet their sort of toileting requirements as she aged up, and they basically kicked her out of the program. So I think, again, there are plenty of independent programs and nonprofit programs that struggle with children who have special needs or children that's children behavioral problems. I don't want to say that that's not the case, but the existence of a policy like that tells me, again, like what who were they wanting to serve? What is the clientele ultimately that is going to make the profit they're looking to make? And there's a quote in there from a director and a former chain employee named Verna Esposito, who I quoted, and she said, "Look, if this becomes the dominant model, if private equity is it, like that's a real problem for all the people who are not going to be able to access that system. And we're going to end up with some bad outcomes, because one thing we know in this country is parents are going to do what they need to do so they can put food on the table and a roof over their heads. Already we have too many parents who, because of our neglect of the childcare system, are putting their children in situations they are not happy about. It's stressful, they're anxious, they're worried, but they don't have a choice. If we start to have a system of haves and have-nots in this country, of childcare rich and the childcare poor, like that is enormously disturbing to a future where all children and families have the opportunity to flourish. And so I really think this is a conversation about private equity, absolutely. But again, I think as we're approaching the end, it's probably good to put a fine point. It's really a conversation about how do we position childcare in American society? Why do we need a system? Who is the system for? What does it deserve in terms of public support? How does it support not just the parents and children, but entire neighborhoods, communities, states, the nation writ large? Or is it just a work support? Is it just a work support where we're just going to put it into place and we're going to offer it to those who are lucky enough to go to an employer, right, who has it, who are lucky enough to make enough money to be of interest to a foreign private equity firm, right? Like there's a real future there where that is more of the system to which we go. I don't think we have to go there. I am optimistic. I'm optimistic that we have this conversation happening, right? Everyone on this call can be a part of this movement, but it's going to take some work to move us to a place where childcare is seen as an essential part of our social fabric, our economic fabric, our national fabric, and where we support it with the dollars that are necessary to make it accessible to everyone.
It is such a powerful conclusion to this. I think you are absolutely right in all of the points you bring up and all of the ways that we can really see this as the inflection point in how we decide to approach childcare, who it's for, and who's running it. I want to turn it back over to Deanna and the ELN team and thank them again for this opportunity. Or Elliot, again, if you guys want to say anything else to wrap it up.
And last thoughts, Elliot?
Nope, just a whole bucket load of gratitude for everyone on this call, for ELN, for Rebecca and for Life Lab.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to also thank everyone who's participating in the chat. We're keeping a transcript of the chat so that we'll be able to go back and refer to things and look at a lot of the links that you've posted and some of the ideas that you've had. I feel like, we're only as smart as our community is, so we have to be able to participate all together and share these conversations. Speaking of which, we will be sharing this conversation. We will be sharing this on our website at earlylearningnation.com and on our Substack and on our YouTube channel. We will be providing transcripts and all kinds of things. And like I said, we're going to take a look and see if there's a way that we could collaborate to answer some more of these really amazing questions that we weren't able to get to. Really, really thoughtful and insightful. But I just want to thank Rebecca and Better Life Lab and New America. Elliot, thank you for this work and your ongoing opinionated reporting and investigative work. It's really, really valuable. Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you next time.
I'm gonna put one more, Elliot's putting his contact information in the chat. I'm gonna put mine as well.
Okay,
as my
contact
subject.
information in the chat. It's appearing on your screen for it, and then I'll end the webinar.
1 second.
Thank you all.
Not awkward at all. Just gonna someone while we're there, it is fantastic. There's Rebecca's contact information and her Substack, as well as Elliot has also shared his email address. And yeah, we look forward to following up and continuing this conversation. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye, y'all.